Welcome comrades, this is the second video on this channel. Today I will be presenting Sornist dialectics. Let us begin by explaining what dialectical materialism is. Dialectical materialism is an outlook, a philosophical outlook on society and humanity in general. It was developed first by Hegel, who was Marx's, basically Marx's inspiration, and it was first developed as a cycle of struggle between different objects, basically different entities. Marx later developed it into dialectical materialism and developed several, and later along with Engels, developed several laws of dialectics. Then of course came along more Marxist theorists who developed more and more, and eventually dialectical materialism was full of explanations of every single societal phenomenon that we may observe. So today we will be talking about Sornist dialectics and what sort of worldview Sornists have. The first law of Sornist dialectics is the law of saturation. The law of saturation basically says that all relations in society are always in direct contradiction and opposition to one another. If the dominant social class were to inflate or saturate, you would be left with a significant alteration in intersocial relations. Capitalist thought bases itself on the common fluctuation of wealth. The problem here is the saturation of the bourgeois class. This acts somewhat in parallel with qualitative change and quantitative change, which is a law developed by Friedrich Engels, who was Marx's associate. Let's give an example. There is one king, and there are several serfs that serve him. Serfs, yes. If there was a larger quantity of a king, he would no longer be a king. If all serfs were kings unto themselves, they would abolish the social term of king. That means if there were too many of such class, there would be none of such class. Basically one of the common problems of capitalism. If everyone was rich, nobody would be rich. Now let's continue with the second law, the law of indignation. The law of indignation is one of the principal laws that I developed in Sornist theory. Basically what it says is, society functions circularly. Indignation exists on both specters. It's not necessarily in direct opposition to the initial thesis or status quo, but proportionally unequivalent, therein creating a struggle between the thesis and the antithesis. For example, fire, stone, and ice. This is an example of object, not of society, so it might seem a little odd, but it is the best example that I could think of. Fire and ice are in opposition, but stone is impartial to both. Fire may melt ice, and ice may quell fire, but stone has relatively no effect. There is an indignation between ice and stone and fire and stone, but not a direct opposition. This is what we call an indignant relativity. It is not directly opposite, but it is indignant. The third law of Sornism is the law of matter, or the law of material relation. I haven't figured what I'd call it yet. Basically, it states that the constitutive motive of all social relations can be both material and non-material. Obviously, when I say non-material, I do not mean idealistic, a prescribed idea that was created by material society. So both are material in reality, even if they are not actually material. An insolvent king is nonetheless a king. This is dependent on the non-material social status of the involved person. A bankrupt landlord is no longer wealthy and therefore no longer has power. His power can be measured in material items and commodities, in possessions, or money, currency. Immaterial social relations are proportional to material relations, as a higher social class is constituted by immaterial relations, which are based on material relations. The bourgeois are constituted by their ownership of the means of production, which are material, but their separation is nevertheless immaterial, relatively immaterial. As mentioned above, they are proportional and based on one another, but not necessarily equivalent. The fourth law of Sornist dialectics is the law of independent alteration. If you've read Chairman Mao Zedong, however you prefer to call him, his work on contradiction, you pretty much understand how all contradictions work. But this is another relativity, as I call it. The law of independent alteration. Contradictions and struggles within societies exist. The fundamental principle of motion entails that motion is constant. Motion is in and of itself change, however relatively small. Constant change cannot resolve a contradiction with an unrelated alteration. Independent alteration is the principle of motion separated from contradictions. Let's take the example of this is another example of objects, not a societal interaction. A maggoty loaf of bread. Bear in mind, if you're eating, you probably don't want to eat anymore, because this is going to be a disgusting example. The contradiction being the dependency of the maggots on the bread and vice versa. If we take a bite out of the loaf of bread or remove the crust, the contradiction remains even with an alteration. Even if there is no crust, there is still bread and there are still maggots in it. The law of the fifth law of Sornism, the Sornist dialectics, is the law of interdependency and the outcome of the circumstances and vice versa. It states that in all aspects we must consider the tendency of the outcome or synthesis being dependent on its preceding state, thesis, and vice versa. If the synthesis is the alteration of the thesis, therefore it can be concluded that they were in connection with each other. They are interdependent. Basically, one functions of the other. We cannot have a synthesis without the initial thesis. The thesis sets out the status quo, and the synthesis is the resolved conclusion of that. So basically, this is separated from independent alteration. If there is a direct antithesis and there is a direct synthesis, they are interdependent. The sixth law of Sornist dialectics is the law of contradiction of the synthesis onto itself. The progression of the synthesis presented as a thesis is the general contradiction of itself. The synthesis is, in the end term, the thesis, synthesis, and antithesis together. The proposition within the synthesis is the notion of presenting itself as a thesis, which is, in and of itself, an antithesis. The final stage presented as the first stage is the negation of contradiction of itself. As it is a repetitive process, this is necessary for the progression of the thesis, unless it is independently altered, which is the fourth law of Sornism. All of these laws function off each other. Some are based off other dialectic laws that were described. Now, I am aware that dialectical materialism is more than just presenting a few laws. There are several works in relation to dialectical materialism were not presented as laws. They were presented as more of essays. But this is the best form that I could make it in. This is so easier to memorize. That will be it for this lesson of Sornism 101. Next lesson will be the economic standpoint of Sornism.